Well, it is noon, so if you're good, I'll get started. Okay.
That sounds great.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for attending this virtual lunch and learn. Um, my name is Nick Havranek. I am the Engagement Strategies Coordinator for University Libraries here at Ball State, and I'm also serving as the Assistant to the Executive Secretary of the Friends of the Alexander M. Bracken Library. It's quite a mouthful. Um, and this series is, well, first of all, it is being recorded and it will be uploaded to the University Library's YouTube channel where we have a playlist of all the past virtual lunch and learn events. So feel free to check that out. Um, and the virtual lunch and learn series was created as kind of a way for us to have some interdisciplinary dialogue here on campus and with anyone in the community. These events are open to the public, so if you want to share the registration link with anyone, feel free to any of our future events, obviously. And they always happen on the third Thursday of every month during the academic year, barring weeks or months that have finals in them or the first month of the academic year. Um, and so this event is, as you can see, Under Pressure, Gifted Students' Vulnerabilities and Stressors, featuring Dr. DaVia Rubenstein. Dr. Rubenstein will discuss her research into the coping mechanisms developed by gifted students dealing with stress, as well as the potential long-term effects that those students may suffer, and how interventions can be improved upon in order to lessen negative outcomes for those students. Lisa is a professor of educational psychology, and she has been at Ball State since 2011. Currently, she teaches courses in qualitative research methodology, research in educational psychology, and the development of creativity. Her research examines motivation, creativity, and talent development. She is serving as the principal investigator of Project Brilliance, which is piloting after-school performing arts programs across Indiana and Florida. And now I would like to hand things off to her.
Well, thank you so much, Nick, for having me. I'm really excited to be here to talk about some of the studies that we've completed in recent years. So the first one that I'm going to be talking about is one that just came out, and we're really excited about it. I hope that if you're interested in this work, you'll want to take a look at some of the actual papers, and I can give you access to those after this talk. So first I thought I would start off with a little math problem for you all. And so I want to see how fast you can complete these two multiplication questions accurately. So if you have a piece of paper nearby, go ahead and see how fast you can do these in. And I'll set my timer on your mark, get set. And when you're ready, you can just either put your thumb up or in the chat box, say when you're done because I have a prize. Go. They have one finisher, Julie and Larissa. Excellent. Good work, folks. Give folks another 10 seconds to see if there are any other winners. Melissa, Susan, Mary Lou, excellent. All right, DJ, nice job, team. So I'm super pumped that nice job, Stacy. I'm glad that a lot of you were able to finish this in like 45 seconds or less. And so you're probably ready for your reward. And if you got these correct, just make sure, here's the answers, 1,020 and 1,533. So if you got those correct and you're one of those folks that said you were finished within 45 seconds, are you ready for your prize? More multiplication problems. I bet you're so excited to have another 23 another 23 problems to show your incredible prowess in multiplication. And I picked this worksheet because I thought Santa doing a karate kick was pretty amazing, so I just thought I'd call your attention to that part. But really, the whole purpose was to help you feel like a gifted kid in an everyday classroom setting. And so part of my past was working with gifted students directly. And I was a program coordinator for a school district in Pennsylvania. And I had many, many gifted students with different gifts, different abilities, different levels of gifts and abilities. And while I was there, I got this job based off of passion, not necessarily based off of credentials, which I think is a really big it's an important point based on just our current state of gifted education is that to work with gifted students, you don't have to have any kind of training or certification. And so we have a lot of teachers that are trying their very best, but when kids finish first or when they finish accurately, rather than thinking about what other problems or what other opportunities they can provide, they simply give more of the same problems. And so that was happening a lot for my students when I was a gifted program coordinator. And this is a picture of one of my students, of course, in cartoon form. This is Jefferson. And in third grade, we always had bring your parent to school day. So the parent would come and sit with the student all day and interact with other students just for that one day. And poor Jefferson, when his mom came for math class, he looked at her and he apologized. He said, "I'm so sorry, Mom. You're going to be so bored during this talk, or this lesson. I know you already know all this, so do I. Sometimes I look at the back of the book and just wish we could start there." And so I think that's another good illustration of the type of gifted students that we're really thinking about here. One of the seminal studies in our field suggested that 40 to 50% of the traditional curriculum could be eliminated for identified gifted students. And if you remember your problem, like your multiplication experience, really we could have even eliminated more than that for most of you. So that brings me to the question, how do gifted students experience school? And this is one of the underlying questions for my entire research. And the theoretical framework that I use to explore this is PVEST, which stands for the phenomenological variant of ecological systems theory, which is a lot, another mouthful, I suppose. And but the key, if you break it down, it makes a lot of sense. And so we're thinking about giftedness as a variant, as a difference from a majority. And because of that, their experiences or the phenomenon of that is going to be different. And that's especially because of the way they interact with the ecological system that they're in. And so the whole title of this theory is exactly explaining this work of thinking about giftedness as a vulnerability that will influence how students interact with their environment. And so today we're going to be looking at some vulnerabilities and how those vulnerabilities lead to both risks, but also provide some protective factors. I think this is particularly important to remember for gifted students because there are risks associated with being gifted, right? It's not just that they're bored or that they're not being challenged in class. There are other risks that when they are being unchallenged in class, they're not learning how to learn. They're not learning new material. Their motivation wanes. We have gifted students who drop out of school. It's not always an easy ride for these gifted students and parents of gifted students. So there are these risks associated, but there are also protective factors. They're problem solvers, they're innovative, they have capabilities of thinking about things flexibly. Then those vulnerabilities, though, lead to specific stressors that cause different challenges, but also offer different supports for them. And we're going to be spending most of our time today within these first two boxes of thinking about how vulnerabilities influence different stressors. And then we will talk a little bit about how they can cope with those stressors, both maladaptive and adaptively. One of the things, the last point I'll make on this theory that is really interesting to me is just this dialectical nature, that it's both challenges and supports. It's adaptive and maladaptive. So it's not just good or bad, it's both. And I think that's important to remember as we progress through this presentation. So today I'm going to take a look at several combinations of vulnerabilities. And so giftedness as a whole is one of those variants that's a vulnerability. But giftedness and being African American, or giftedness and being on the spectrum with autism spectrum disorder, or rather autism spectrum is more preferred now, but or being in the LGBTQ community. So each of these branches increases those levels of vulnerability. So they're compounding vulnerabilities. So first, I just like to spend a little bit of time on giftedness in general. And this comes from the paper that I referred to earlier on that we just published, Under Pressure. And this is the overarching set of findings from that paper. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the methods unless you want to talk about methods. I would be happy to do so. Um, I would prefer we could spend some time on that after, I think, because I have 4 studies that I'd like to look at briefly because I think they tell a fuller story. And so again, we talked about different vulnerabilities of gifted students, but they also, because of those vulnerabilities, there are specific stressors and supports that these gifted students are facing. And some of the times it's the same thing. So for example, providing academic challenge is a support for students who are ready to learn, and not providing academic challenge is a stressor, which causes many of those students to look for challenges elsewhere. Another huge finding from our work was the importance of supporting diverse identities. In fact, we didn't go into this paper with the objective of exploring diverse identities. That was one of those findings that came out of what the students were talking about at the time. And they were talking about just how important it was that teachers recognized their additional identities. And then, of course, similar to other students, they wanted their teachers to be available, understanding, and passionate about their subject. And when they weren't, that was a huge stressor for those students. Another interesting level of stressors came from the peers that the students were surrounded by. And one of the interesting things about these students is that they were attending a residential gifted high school. And so you might think that that place might have additional stressors not faced from their local homeschools. However, a lot of their local homeschools had much more stress associated with them. Specifically, the homeschools weren't offering academic challenges, which was causing a lot of stress. And then they were asking the students to compete for class rankings. And so that added a lot of stress, whereas this gifted residential high school, eliminated class ranking, and the students consistently talked about how that was a very positive experience for them. When it came to their friends, they also recognized when their peers supported their diverse identities as well. And they talked about just the struggles of finding a true friend in their homeschool versus finding true friends in their gifted residential school, and how much easier it was to find friends when they were with other gifted students. So then how did they cope with these stressors and supports? We found that they coped using problem-focused coping mechanisms. That means compared to emotion-focused coping. So problem-focused is when you're focused outwardly on fixing the problem itself. And the main way they fixed their problem was changing schools. And that's such a drastic change. Many of them and their parents gave up advocating for their students in their home schools for additional challenge. Either they gave up or they decided it wasn't worth trying. And that is a consistent finding across multiple studies that I have done. Advocating within school settings is often where they start before changing schools, but as I mentioned, that's not always a productive, that doesn't always have productive outcomes. For emotion-focused coping, they really didn't have the same strategies available for them. This is a place where I would recommend a lot more work being done, because the emotion-focused coping was more on being isolated. They would decide to pull themselves out of conversations or different situations to cope with the stress. And that's a coping mechanism that we don't want them to always rely upon. It and it had some very negative consequences for some of the students. Then the cognitive restructuring was simply reframing what was happening, and that was more adaptive most of the time, but some of the time it made them question their own giftedness. So if they were facing a stressor like not having enough academic challenge, they decided, well, maybe I'm not gifted, maybe I don't need this. And so they would question that. Other strategies included working with a counselor, but to be honest, that was only 2 of the interviewed students had counseling sessions scheduled. And so that's another recommendation from this work that we thought would be very important. I wanted to give you some examples of the student words because I think those are very powerful. For the academic stressors, the lack of academic challenge, uh, they talked about how they were facing this lack of challenge in their home schools. They said the honors teachers were teaching the same class as the non-honors classes, but they were just giving more work. Same with our English class. You're reading the same book. You have to write just twice as long of a paper over it. Everyone was miserable together. Another student talked about their academic challenges as just being busy work, grinding through information, doing simple assignments over and over again. And another student talked about how people who are considered gifted tend to get left behind when it comes to academic support. This was definitely prevalent at my homeschool. We weren't really taught how to study or how to learn, so it felt like we hit a brick wall when we came to learning something new. I think that's really important that it's not only they're bored right now, that they're not receiving the level of academic challenge that they need, but it's that it has implications in the future for what's going to happen to these students when they finally do have and face an academic challenge. We can't continue to give students simply more problems. And some people, you know, it requires training, though, to think about how else we can challenge students. And so this is an example of a problem that those of you who got those first 2 problems correct in 45 seconds, uh, if instead of giving you the prize of more work, like more multiplication problems, if I gave you this problem and gave you the opportunity to really explore the pattern of the solid cubes and the cubes that have holes. And this was one of the things that I did with my students, and it's part of a website called Enrich Maths. And the cool thing is that the students can submit their responses to true mathematicians at the University of Cambridge, and they have monthly problems that they give the students, and then they curate those submissions and they post the best ones and they add a narrative. And one time, not to brag, but my students were featured on, just for 1 month, were featured on, their solutions were featured on this website. So it was really cool. So there are things you can do to increase academic challenge, even if it doesn't mean putting them a full grade level above. Although I wouldn't, I acceleration is a very good option for many students, even though a lot of lay people don't agree with that. But I have a lot of research that suggests that that's a very powerful option for many students. And I'd be happy to talk about that more if you would like. And then in terms of academic supports, attending the gifted school made all the difference for many of these students. They say they got a lot of opportunities to do stuff like research studies, like under college professors taking college courses, which is a motivational factor to get ahead and do more stuff while you can. And so I think that's another aspect of giftedness that we neglect sometimes, is without these challenges, their motivation wanes. And in this environment, they were able to receive and have access to these really exciting and supportive teachers. And I love how they describe some of their teachers. One of them said, "I love that man. He's just so excited. He talks really fast, but it's at the perfect rate. And I'm listening, and he wants to be in the class. It's his favorite part of the day. He cares a lot and he puts a lot into his students." And I just thought, what a powerful environmental space for these students to explore. There are many quotes like this about the exciting and supportive teachers. And there, like I mentioned previously, the quotes about just eliminating class ranking, those were really insightful as well. And so one of the students that we interviewed talked about this rogue student who decided to take physics instead of history in freshman year. And um, but physics was weighted, so this one student got ahead that very first freshman year, and he was first, and there were 30 people tied for second place, and this really mattered and bothered this student, the unfairness of it and the competition. But then and the students in general agreed that they don't do class ranking at this gifted school. So it's funny that this gifted school is actually less competitive than it was in their in their old schools. So, in general, if I were to summarize our findings from this work, it was that the lack of an academic challenge caused a great amount of stress in these students' lives. They knew what they were missing and they wanted it. They wanted to be challenged to increase their motivation and to increase their self regulation so that they would learn how to study. And they coped with that by going to a new school, and they were able to cope with it as well when they had really supportive teachers. The stressor, though, that we didn't expect was that most of the students really talked about how important these diverse identities were, which then feeds into some of our other work. Which then, so if you remember that opening slide where it's giftedness and we have several vulnerabilities underneath of it, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about some of those additional vulnerabilities. And one was African American students. And here we're talking about Black brilliance. And I thought I would share a a little clip of a student that really inspired some of our work.
So we know you love music, you love Bob Marley, you also love reading and books. And
Yes.
tell us about this big campaign and how it started.
So the 1000 Black Girl Books campaign is the social media campaign started by me in November of 2015. So in my 5th grade class, I wasn't seeing Black girl stories being reflected, and it wasn't something that we were told, but I could see that story in my home and in the books that my parents gave me. I knew that like kids in my school, they might not always be able to see themselves as characters that are important and things that are valued in their school system. So I decided to collect 1000 books where Black girls are the main characters. I was able to collect today 9,500 books. And
And you're writing a book too.
yeah, so my book, Marley Dice Gets It Done, and So Can You, is a guide for kids my age and older to be able to use their gifts and talents and the things that they enjoy doing to help their community and to make the world a better place like I did in their own unique way.
So we know you love music.
So I wanted to just share that example of Marley for several reasons. One of which is clearly she's brilliant and taking this ownership for her own project and own work. But I wanted to highlight that that work wasn't occurring in school. It was actually occurring. It was occurring outside of school and in a response to her school experiences. This aligns with the work that we saw with the students coming to this gifted academy when, they selected a new school because they weren't getting what they needed in their home schools. So, this. So one of the next papers that we wrote, well, it actually came before this last release, but this paper is called Black Brilliance and Creative Problem Solving in Fugitive Spaces. And what we did was we reviewed all of the literature for the last 20 years, I believe, on Black creativity. And what we found was that the environment is not providing effective support for these students. And you can see in this graph, this is a survey of public participation in the arts. And you can see that as funding decreases for the arts, it doesn't always influence students equally. So specifically, white students are up here. And of course, this is also illustrative of not many students or not all students having access to arts opportunities. But here what you can see is the cuts in arts over time is disproportionately affecting African American and Hispanic students. And so while when we started, it was the difference between 59% and 50, now it's the difference between 57%, which is still down from the start, but it's much more significantly down for these underrepresented students. And so our creatively gifted students are not having access to the arts and creative opportunities to the same extent that white students are. And actually, I'm going to skip this one, but one of the studies that we integrated into our systematic review was Muhammad's study about their after school program. And this student talked about how she takes on a different character when she's in school because she feels like a lot of the things I say when I write won't be received with good intentions. It goes back to the censorship thing. You know what I mean? Like, it didn't happen to us censored, so I shouldn't have to censor myself when I say it. However, I feel like when I'm in school, censorship comes into play and I don't like it. I disagree with it. But when you're working in the confines of education and a grade is involved, I feel like truly sometimes that's the only thing that drives people is that grade at the end of the day. And I think the concept of Black creators being censored in school is prevalent throughout the literature. And so what we did was we created, based on that theoretical model first we talked about, we created our own model that applies to Black students' creative educational experiences. And what we found was almost none of the papers we reviewed were reviewing experiences within school settings. And my colleague calls this fugitive spaces. So spaces that they've created outside of school that are just their own. That includes places like their homes, their communities, and that really they are able to make their own. And I think about how it's the same, like gifted students and gifted creators are always making these own spaces beyond what we are providing within a common space. It's really difficult to think about gifted Black students because they're not only underrepresented in the arts, but they're underrepresented in general. And one of the key issues is that they're more like, when they have a Black teacher, they're 3 times more likely to be placed in the gifted program. So that's a pretty stunning finding from some previous work. And so what we found here, when we have giftedness vulnerabilities connected to Black brilliance, we see the same stressor of a lack of academic challenge, but then we see an additional stressor of a lack of cultural awareness. And so Marley is a really good example of that, where not only was she not being challenged in school, but she also wasn't being given books that would inspire her. She said she was tired of reading about white boys and dogs. And so that's what that was the impetus for her collecting these other books. And so in order to support them, they've turned to fugitive spaces and designed their own curriculum. But that again is happening outside of the school day, which is really a prohibitive for some students. They're not getting those same opportunities and experiences to grow. In the gifted residential high school, they address this actually and they host diversity and inclusivity training at the beginning of the year. And the students that we interviewed actually talked about this training. So this is a pseudonym for one of the students. Dakota described how diversity and inclusivity training at the beginning of the school year opened their eyes. We did a training which definitely helped because from being in the middle of nowhere, I didn't know any of this stuff. And so it's not only important for us to recognize it, it's important for the other students and their peers to recognize how important these diverse identities are. The next vulnerability I wanted to talk about, and I know I'm running, like I'm going to try to finish up within like 8 minutes so that we'll have time for questions. But the next vulnerability that I wanted to talk about was twice exceptionality. And twice exceptional, for those of you who may not be familiar with the term, means that it's gifted students who have an additional exceptionality. So being gifted plus having ADHD or being gifted and on the spectrum. And again, just like being gifted and Black has specific additional vulnerabilities and stressors, so does being gifted and having an additional exceptionality. And I wanted to introduce you to one of those students who actually went to IUPUI. And so this is Jacob Burnett. And I'm going to just switch my screen really quickly and share 1 minute of Jacob's clip.
No one could have predicted that Jake would even make it to college. Just before his second birthday, he began to regress, stopped speaking and making eye contact. After consulting with several doctors, the diagnosis was autism.
We went through speech therapy, physical therapy, developmental therapy, occupational therapy. A therapist came to the home.
He was going further and further from our world into a world of his own. And I really was just baffled at how we were going to get him back out of that world.
And how did you get him back out of that world?
We realized that Jacob was not happy unless he was doing something he loved.
Which even as a 3-year-old was math and science. His parents say the more he focused on the subjects he loved, the more he began to communicate.
You could just see him just relax. You could just see him feel like, thank goodness we're not working on something that I can't do today.
And how long did it take for him to, as you say, come back?
By the time he was kindergarten age, 5, 6, he was still behind as far as speaking with others and socializing with others. But he was also light years ahead of everybody else. He was coming home asking us, when am I going to learn something at school today? I want to learn algebra.
It was trying to keep Jake challenged that led to a kind of double life, elementary school by day and sitting in on college courses in the evening.
So I think Jake is a really interesting case, and since he grew up in Indiana, I thought he would be interesting to highlight as well. And he, from that clip, a few things I wanted you to take away would be that he, without being challenged, he just kept retreating further and further into himself. And so when he was only focused on things he couldn't do, it made it even worse. And so when he was given the opportunity to read science and math textbooks, he actually taught himself high school math, like all of the series of high school math in less than 2 months. And that was so that he could go to college and interact with the college professors and be on campus. And so, of course, this is an extreme case of giftedness, and not all gifted students need to go to college. However, we need to be aware that that when we're not challenging gifted students, they can retreat into their own world. And especially gifted students with autism may not be able to communicate clearly why they're retreating. And so it's something we just need to be aware of. And that kind of led us to a different study where we studied the lived experience of parents of gifted students. And that parents aspect was particularly interesting because, we have this concept that being gifted is so easy, but it's not easy at all. There's a lot of challenges associated, and when the students are on the spectrum, there's even combined challenges. And so one of the parents started to talk about how the problem started in preschool when they were sitting doing letters, and he wanted to read books to everyone. So at that point, he was moved into a kindergarten program, but we started to have even more behavior problems. He was in public school for about 3 weeks, and he kept saying, I want to go in the leaves and bury myself. And so this has significant implications for their well-being. A few of the findings that we have from this study is summarized within this figure, but we found that the gifted and ASD characteristics presented challenges at school presented challenges for both families and schools. In fact, one of the parents talked about how her own family members called Child Protective Services on her because her child was having so many meltdowns, and they just didn't understand, that's part of being on the spectrum, is that transitions are particularly difficult and they can totally melt down during those time periods. And so it's hard to understand how you have a student who may understand, like in this case, electricity is not my specialty, but the electrical, like, infrastructure of a building, how all the electricity is running through the circuits, all of that. This 5-year-old understood that, but couldn't tie his shoes, couldn't stop from having a meltdown. Just because they're gifted doesn't mean they're gifted in social areas or other areas, and we call that asynchronous development. And it's very confusing to people outside of the field, or outside of people who have really researched this topic for their own kids. But they have incredible intellect and intense interest, but those intense interests can take over. And so that's really important to be aware of. We have students who are unable to communicate or react in a socially conventional manner. So one of the parents just expressed how sad it was to when she took her kid to her gifted student who's on the spectrum to Walt Disney World, and the whole time he was going through the park with a really big frown on his face, and he was acting like everything about his body language was unhappy. But at the end of the day, he told her that he had a really good time. And so it's just very difficult to understand students who are not responding in socially conventional ways. And they have this extreme need for predictability, structure, and rules. And that led to many teachers not being equipped to provide educational experiences. They didn't have the professional knowledge to really understand these students, which is the same thing that's happening in all of our other vulnerabilities. Like, I hope you can see these connections across these studies, is that the teachers don't have the professional knowledge of this population to make appropriate educational adaptations. And so they would either have too high of expectations for their social knowledge or too low of expectations for their academic knowledge. And they would either disproportionately focus on strengths or weaknesses without providing this structure, this structural flexibility. And that required parents to continually advocate for these students. And that just causes so much stress on the parents and so much responsibility that they often got tired of trying to advocate for their students, which resulted in a lot of them to make elective school changes. What you can see on this graph, which I think is pretty interesting, is you can see a lot. So each of the students' parents, each of the students that we interviewed, their parents are on this x-axis, and then on the y-axis is their age, and different events happen at different times. And what you can see here is every time you see an E, that means an elective change of school. In every single case, there are students that are changing schools, whether it's just one time they tried a new school, whether it's 3 times or 5 times. One of the students lived in New York City, so they had a lot of opportunities to try new schools, but it was not easy to find a school that could handle both their strengths and weaknesses together. And again, I think about our gifted school, our gifted residential school from the first study, and that's what all of the students did as well, as they ended up changing schools. And in our gifted school from the first study, we had students talk about this, and even students who were not twice exceptional said that they found it impressive that the students that had these learning disabilities were able to keep up with the high learning curve. That proves just because you have a learning disability doesn't mean you can't be one of the top tier students. And that quote to me was really powerful because it meant that it's it's a really good experience for other gifted students to be exposed to twice exceptional students. It gives them a more well-rounded perspective of what's happening. And so if we think about our similar structure here with stressors and supports, we can see that this lack of academic challenge is consistent across groups. But here it was a lack of twice exceptional awareness. Like, what do you do? What do teachers and schools do to address both strengths and weaknesses? And again, the outcome was shifting schools and trying to find schools that address both strengths and weaknesses. I was planning on addressing LGBTQ, but I will save that study for a different day. And I would like just to finish with two well, I'll just get to the main point of the twice exceptional study, was just that again, the lack of academic challenge was really important for these students. And in fact, many of them, when their social lives were scary and uncertain, they would turn to their academic lives and put even more effort and focus into those spaces. And so sometimes they compensate in one area from one area to another. They experience the lack of social support so frequently in their schools. I guess I have to, um, even the teachers. So this student from the gifted residential high school talked about if you go into the wrong hallway, meaning their home schools, slurs were thrown everywhere. Teachers would give you a hard time if you wanted to retake a test because they knew things about you they didn't like. And a lot of religion was pushed because it was such a small town. And so this does influence their academic experiences, but it influences their social experience as well. But when they got to the academic, gifted high school, residential high school, they were able to really see, and grow their worldview. And they said, even if people don't like you here, they don't go up to you and they're not mean. And so, besides being academically challenged, I've met a lot of cool people. And so I think it's important to see students as these well-rounded people that have both social needs, they have learning needs, and without those needs being addressed, it can have very negative consequences for these students. And so the overarching findings that I hope you leave here with is that gifted students have specific academic needs that are often unmet, and they have additional vulnerabilities that influence their needs and the school's ability to meet them. So that's my presentation, and I would be happy to answer any questions you have on any of the studies or gifted students in general.
I saw that Mary Lou put in the chat, really important point. There are risks. The first time that they are challenged is quite a threat to their identity if an excellent student, quote unquote.
Yeah. And it's really tricky when you try to think about when will they first be challenged, right? If it's the first time they're challenged is when they go to grad school, they can be really questioning whether or not they fit in there. And without having developed those persistent skills of studying, it can be a really scary place that can force them to drop out or develop anxiety. There's a lot of a lot of scary things about not being challenged. Yeah, thank you, Lynn, for that question. What if parents and students don't have an option to attend a gifted school? Such a good question because what we've found is that that's the option that most of the students that we've been working with end up doing. Leading change from within is difficult, and I don't have any examples at the moment, which is pretty sad, because a lot of times, so I worked with the parents with the gifted students on the spectrum, and they even tried to send teachers to conferences. And I, th- I think sometimes when parents come in and make suggestions, they're not seen, in the best light. That teachers might see them as, you're trying to do my job and I'm the expert here. So building those relationships is just really obviously important, but it's a tricky line to walk. I think I'm going to take your name and information, and I can look a little bit more into this. In my own work, I haven't seen a lot of success in this, but I would be happy to look into that further. Any other questions or things we could talk about?
I kind of have I guess it's probably a pretty basic question, but in that timeline that you showed of the interviews you did with the students, there were squares representing start of services. What's that referring to specifically?
Yeah, so let me pull that up really briefly. Yeah, so start of services could be either services associated with being gifted or being on the spectrum. And also, being on the spectrum often came with different types of services like occupational therapy. Uh, and so, like, you could see this person didn't get any services until all the way up to this age. There's one student, Chris, yeah, this student didn't get any services until he was about 14, and that was actually after this case is so weird. In an weird is the wrong word. This case is interesting, um, and a little bit sad because in this case, the school would not let this student into the gifted program. They wouldn't even try to identify him because they said he wasn't creative, like a creative problem solver, so he didn't belong in the gifted program. But what they meant by that was that he wasn't a divergent thinker, which, like, and I'm very passionate about creativity, but it's not the only type of giftedness you can have. And so you have some very analytical, gifted students who may not demonstrate that creative characteristic. So that prevented him from being identified as gifted, and the giftedness prevented him from being identified as being ASD because he was able to compensate in a way that didn't that the ASD didn't manifest itself quite as obvious as some of the other students. And so he didn't receive services until much later. And actually, these identifications came outside of school. And what they ended up doing is over the summer, they took him to the local college and he took an astrophysics class, I think. Or physics. It was a significant class, and he got basically a perfect score on it. And so, the elective change was going into college courses at a very young age because they wouldn't let him into the gifted program. So, yeah, the start of services is just whenever some additional service came into play for these students.
Okay, thank you. So then Pete had a lot of services start before a diagnosis was ever made. That's interesting too.
Yeah, and part of this can be also attributed to very active parents. So these are the parents that wanted to be interviewed. And so in the very beginning, Pete's parents, I mean, even at the start of, two, they're looking for different schools, different opportunities. And a lot of autism services start earlier. And so they just keep searching for different opportunities.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, it's so tricky because there's no state or federal legislation on gifted programs. And so people aren't mandated to provide them at all. So it becomes really tricky in these cases.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Amy. Um, Interestingly, one thing I've seen in the Yorktown community schools is they have high ability like kind of bifurcated from the rest, but there aren't enough students, right, that meet that true definition of like high ability. And so it's very interesting. And my daughter is in the high ability, but doesn't really meet the definition. But like my son is in the high ability and really does meet the definition. Um, and I find that like honestly, the teachers are more directed towards like students who are like at or above grade level than to really understand how to address true high ability, because the majority of what they see as high ability is just a student who's like on track. And then when they see a true high ability student, like a lot of these problems that you talked about, I think happen, even though technically they're in this so-called like high ability classroom.
Yeah, that's interesting because in it's tricky because it's difficult to find high quality materials as well for the teachers, and so to think about what kind of curriculum options are there for them to, so it's, it actually goes back a little bit to the multiplication problem, where you could create this, if they know this, you could provide this, but that means you also have to understand this type of problem, right? To be able to give it to your students, and you have to have the time to identify it. And so teachers are more focused on students who can't get this or who need this than students who, need this. And especially if you have a mixed classroom. In fact, there was a study a while ago that suggested that in a traditional classroom, there's up to 9 grade levels of reading ability. And so being a teacher in that setting is just very difficult. I don't know if I answered. I don't know what the question was actually. So
Yeah, I guess I just didn't have like a great question, but I think it's just there's a challenge of just quantity, right? And then how do we like find enough teachers to address that, like that are actually trained, because I think like what you were kind of saying is like it is special to be high ability and not always just in a great way. Like, there's a lot of nuances there. And so like having teachers that really understand that work with these students is like really important. Um, but it's just a challenge. And I don't know what your thoughts are, but like in honesty, I'm not thrilled that like they create this whole classroom of high ability students, instead of thinking about a program that might pull out those students that really clearly are defined in that way for a little bit of extra, you know.
yeah, for sure. I think we also talk about this concept of non-therapeutic dosage. So, if you took a quarter of an aspirin, it probably wouldn't help your headache. Similarly, if you only get pulled out, and this was the problem I was facing when I was a program coordinator in Pennsylvania, they got pulled out for an hour and a half a week. And it was so disconnected from their every day that they were spending, most days bored, and most days they were acting out in class, and most days they were not paying attention. And so when we had the opportunity to pull them out, they really enjoyed it. They learned something, but it was disconnected. And from my perspective, it was likely a non-therapeutic dosage. And so, in the pullout case, my ideal world would be pullout based on subject. So specifically, you would have like this high ability math teacher pull out your 7 math students and work with them on these types of problems, right? So they would be able to go into more depth, move at a faster pace, have their needs met, and then they'd go back to their regular classroom. And that way they wouldn't have to be gifted in all areas. They could be specifically gifted in math, and then they would have another pull-out opportunity for reading. And so because in elementary especially, those are the two subjects that take up the most time, and so that would be the 2 I would start with, and I would try to have them pulled out consistently during their math class or consistently during their reading class and address those topics in more depth or at a faster pace. That would be my ideal world. And if there is a high ability class, in my ideal world, they would have a teacher who would be strong at differentiation, which we all know differentiation is really difficult. But the idea is if you have a big enough number of students in your class, you're forced to pay attention to them. So we call this like cluster grouping within a classroom. But still, a lot of teachers still ignore that cluster, even if it's 7 students need something different. uh, they'll ignore those students and focus on the 14 students that need the at grade level material or even below grade level, and they'll just give the gifted students more work rather than different work. So it takes training, and there are state grants that you can use for training, and like Ball State has a great graduate online program that teachers can complete in a year. But again, it takes time and effort and people to see the benefit of it.
Hey, well, it is 1 o'clock. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to wrap up this conversation. But I'm sure if anyone else had any more questions, Lisa, you're probably open to emails or whatever.
Yeah, definitely. And here's my email. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Lynn, um, I didn't actually see your name didn't quite pop up on my email, so I was wondering if you want more information, if you could email me. So I'll just leave it at that. But thanks, Lynn, for the question. It was really good.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Lisa. That was very informative, and that is very important work. It sounds like a real challenge, but very important. Um, so with that, that is the final Lunch and Learn of the year, and we will pick it up again in September of 2025 this year. So, if you know any faculty members who have some really great research they could present, feel free to share with me, and you can reach out to them. So thank you again, Lisa, and thanks for everyone for attending. Have a great day.
Thank you so much for hosting, Nick.
Of
It was
course.
really fun.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye-bye.